enrollment and permanent school closure in St. Louis public schools. I am a doctoral candidate in the Education Policy and Equity program at SLU. But this is a project that's been very close to me for a lot of reasons. But prior to coming to SLU, I was a science and math teacher in a school that I ultimately closed while I served as president of the Board of Education for St. Louis Public Schools. So I've seen the public school system in St. Louis from a variety of perspectives. I'm also a public school parent. I have 2 children in public school in the city. So it's important to me that we have this fuller policy conversation about enrollment in school closure from a perspective that ties in pieces of the city and the city's history. And so that's really the impetus for this project today. So a little background context. The story of population decline in St. Louis is pretty well known. We hit our peak as a city in the 1950 census, and we've been in a state of perpetual decline ever since. So that prompted policymakers and other advocates in the city to recognize a need to reduce the size of the city's government. So in 2012, Proposition R was passed, and that effectively reduced the number of wards in the city from 28 to 14 following the release of the 2020 census figures. So we saw in city government a ward reduction process and redrawing of the ward boundaries to reduce the size of our elected representation from 28 to 14. As that happened, we see that there are ramifications for the city, but also for the school system. So the child population, and in this presentation, I'll be referring to that as children from birth to 17. That child population has declined by 40% since the year 2000. So in particular, children and their families are moving away from North City. So we're seeing a decline all over, but it is more substantial there. Despite this ever declining population, we've seen our public school options expand and contract over the past 32 years. And it's important, I think, to mention also that the private school, particularly Catholic school systems, have also felt effects of population decline. The Archdiocese and the City of St. Louis commissioned their own strategic study that they called the All Things New initiative that's helping to guide their decision-making about parishes and also schools. So in this table, we can see just how much things have changed since 1990. So again, child population here refers to children birth through age 17. So in 1990, we had approximately 100,000 children, 43% of whom were enrolled in a public school. At that time, the only public schools were governed by St. Louis Public Schools, or SLPS. By 2020 census, we had 54,000 children living in the city, but almost 60% of those were enrolled in a public school. That public school system by now also includes charter public schools. So overall, in the time period that we'll be talking about in this study, public school enrollment declined by nearly 40%, and the city's child population has been cut almost in half. This report is data from the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education and the United States Census Bureau. We're looking at building level data for student enrollment going all the way back to 1991. Again, those are all the years that are publicly available through DESE. Population data starting with the 1990 census, because that's the year closest to the study period. 1 year, 3 year, 5 year estimates were not available for the going back that far. So we're looking at only the 10-year census numbers. A lot of the schools that were included in this study are no longer in operation. So I use the City of St. Louis address and property information search function on the City of St. Louis's website to identify the ward that the school is in or was in. And for some schools that were particularly tricky to locate an address for, I use the St. Louis Post-Dispatch archives and the St. Louis Public Schools websites to look at those addresses and the dates that they were opened and closed. So a couple definitions to get clarity on at the beginning of this presentation. I am not distinguishing between district and charter schools. intentionally. So I wanted to make sure that we were looking at our public school system as a system and looking at trends across the system. And the best way to do that, in my mind, was to consider all public schools together. I've also opted in many of the figures and charts to separate in K-8 and 9-12, just so we can get a maybe more finer understanding of what's happening. At various points in our public education system here, we've done elementary schools through 6th grade, through 5th grade, sometimes through 8th grade. And so instead of trying to figure out all of those grade span changes, I'm looking at K-8 and through 9-12. Anytime I'm referencing a ward here, it will be the 2020 ward boundaries. So these are the new 14 wards as they are currently set across the city of St. Louis. Just a note about DESI data is very, very, very messy. A lot of times school names will not be consistent from year to year. Maybe a school included a period in their name. So if it's St. Louis Language Immersion Schools, there may be a period there and maybe not in another year. And so for that reason, it sometimes looks like we might have a lot more schools than we actually do, or it looks like a school maybe closed when it didn't. So just recognizing that DESI data, if you are a researcher, is very messy. You just will need to take some time to figure that out. And I also want to mention that this is not a study of vacant buildings, even though that's a topic very closely related to school closure. So in a lot of cases, maybe even most cases, school closure will result in a vacant building, but that isn't always the case. So sometimes a school will close and the building will be repurposed almost immediately. Other times we'll have a vacant building and no school closure if a school just changes location. So they are closely related, but vacant buildings do not feature in this study. So let's look at enrollment over the public education system going back to 1991. In this figure, I'm including all schools, including specialized schools, like maybe alternative schools, therapeutic schools, schools that serve an entirely special education population of students. So every public school that was operating is included here. So the brown line at the top represents all students in any grade K through 12. The next line down, the blue line, is children in grades K-8, and the bottom orange line is high school. So we can see that the vast majority of our public education students are enrolled in grades K through 8. And this is also the grade span that's seen the most fluctuation over time. High school enrollment, on the other hand, has been pretty consistent over the past 30 years, a few fluctuations here and there, but in general, we've hovered right around that 10,000 student mark. This slide, we break down enrollment at the elementary school level for grades K through 5. So you can see every grade as an individual line. In general, what we're seeing is all of those grades are decreasing. And while they may have had some variation in enrollment in the early years of this study period, by now we're all hovered right around the same. All the grades are enroll about the same number of students. Here we see grades 6 through 8. So we were at our peak for middle school around the year 2005, declined for a while and then has leveled off. And high school, grades 9 through 12. So we know that some of this is due to high school completion rates that have increased over time. Fewer students are dropping out of school. But still, we don't have that wide variation in the number of students that are enrolled in each of the grades. Okay, so because school closure in St. Louis has happened so much, there are lots of things that are school closure, even some that maybe don't necessarily, we wouldn't have thought of at first. On the other hand, there are things that are not included as a closure in this study. So I wanted to provide some examples just to make clear how I'm counting school closure and what is not. So the most straightforward example is like example 1. Scruggs Elementary, which is was an SLPS school, closed in 2009. All other schools in SLPS remained open. So that's a very straightforward example of what a school closure is. Likewise, some charter schools have also closed. So Proclaris Master Academy closed in 2018. For that charter school, it was the only school in its LEA. We also see closure that can also close in LEA. So Imagine Academy is the most prominent example of this. So in 2012, 6 schools in the Imagine LEA closed at the same time.
And not end up in the hands of terrorists.
So let's talk about things that are not closure. So a charter school, Paideia Academy, originally operated as part of the SLPS LEA, had 2 locations, but over time, eventually split off and became its own LEA. So the schools did not close. It was more of an administrative change in how things were coded with DESE. But if you were looking strictly at DESE codes and counting things that way, it looks like a closure because the code ceased to be used. But really the school continued operating. So we are not counting that as closure. Example 5 here has happened a handful of times in our data. So the school Wilkinson moved to a previously closed school, Rowe Elementary. So in 2008, Wilkinson moved from one location to the other. The Wilkinson building closed and continued to operate. I am not counting that as a closure in the data because Wilkinson as a school maintained continuous operation. So here's an example of where you might have a vacant building, but not a school closure. Similarly, St. Louis language immersion schools have had over the years a number of schools and a number of campuses, and then ultimately combined into one location under one name. So this graph shows all the fluctuations in the school system for every year going back to 1991. So here, blue bars indicate the number of schools that have opened in a given year. The gold bars are showing the number of schools that have closed in a given year. And the brown line tracks the total number of schools operating over time. We only have one instance in this 32-year period from 1991 to 2023 where the number of schools stayed the same from one year to the next. And that was in the 1998-1999 school years. In every other year of this study, at least one school has opened or closed. So in 1991, we started with 119 schools. At the time, we're all SLPS. Now we have 98 schools across SLPS and charter LEAs. So it's a net decrease of 21 schools. However, if we look at these year-to-year fluctuations and total them up, we've seen 104 schools close over the past 32 years, while 85 have opened. So we know that enrollment has dropped from over the study time period pretty consistently. There were a few times where maybe we saw a slight increase, but overall, we've seen a steady decline of enrollment, even though we have a wildly fluctuating number of schools, a number of offerings for parents to choose from. So here we'll start talking about average building size. We know that the child population has declined, the enrollment has declined, but schools have continued to open. On average, the average building enrollment has seen a decrease of about 80 students. But if we separate out the K-8 and 9-12 schools, we can see that high school has had a much sharper decline. So that's the brown line in this figure. So in 1991, high schools were on average 712 students. Now we see that they're just under 400. So they've lost not quite half of their average building enrollment. So part of that is because we have a net increase of 5 high schools, even though high school enrollment has declined by about 25%. On the other hand, elementary K-8 enrollment has stayed a lot more steady. So it's only seen a decline of from 313 students on average to 254. That is due in part to having a decrease of 26 schools over the study period. So here is the best ward map that I could find. It is courtesy of Fox 2 News. Has a couple errors, which we'll talk about here. The city maps I've decided not to use. They have a lot more information on them. So in addition to ward boundaries, they may have other geopolitical boundaries like state or other other like state representatives, state senate, things like that, and also some streets. And it's just hard to put into a format that's good here. So this is, I'm choosing to use the Fox 2 map. There are a couple places where their wards are missing. So this red section, I hope you can see my pointer, this here between wards 8 and 5 is actually ward 6. So it is not a continuation of ward 1. And this purple word up here that does not have a label is ward 14. So wards are numbered beginning in the south with ward 1 and go up to the north with ward 14. There is no hard and fast categorization of what counts as a north ward and what counts as a south, but we can see that the central part of St. Louis is right around here. So wards 9 and 10 are, in 11 maybe are central. Ward 8 crosses all of those boundaries. So we don't use those designations here as what is north and what is south. Now, we're looking at geography here with wards. For these ward analyses, they do not include schools that are alternative schools, therapeutic schools, entirely special ed schools. So those schools have a very specialized program. They target a very specific student population, and they're not necessarily as tied to their geography as other schools are. So they're taken out of the analysis. So for that reason, if you're looking at these geography analyses compared to those introduction slides at the beginning, you'll see a difference in numbers, and that's because it works out to be about 1,500 or 2,000 students that are enrolled in those programs that may not be included here. Those schools also, by their nature of being very specialized, are typically smaller and can bias some of the estimates that we have. So they've been taken out for the remainder of these slides. This figure here includes a lot of lines, a line for each ward. It's hard to track the trend for any individual ward. But the takeaway here is that public school enrollment varies wildly across our wards. The ward with the most schools is Ward 8. It has 14 schools. So it's that one that we talked about, kind of that goes along the eastern edge of the city. Wards 1, 2, 6, and 10 have 3 schools each. So we have quite a range in school representation by ward. The number of schools offered does not necessarily correspond with ward enrollment. We have the fewest students in Ward 6, only 792 students attending school in that ward, while Ward 14 has 4,500. So if we're thinking too about population, and I don't believe I have a graph in here for that, this is not necessarily where students live. We know that the northern wards like Ward 14 have seen the biggest drops in child population, yet they continue to enroll the most schools in those wards enroll more students than maybe their like equal share. All wards have at least one school in the K-8 range, and 9 wards have at least one high school. These numbers, again, are slightly different from what we saw in the introduction, again, not including the alternative and therapeutic schools. Across the city, we've seen public school enrollment decrease by 40%, but that's not evenly distributed across the city. So schools are not distributed evenly, enrollment is not distributed evenly, and neither is enrollment decline. So some wards have lost nearly 80% of their student enrollment, while others have increased by 40 or 50%. Only 5 wards, wards 2, 4, 5, 8, and 14, saw any increase in their enrollment. Let me go back just for 1 second. I would like to, maybe not. Okay, well, I'll just tell you. So I would have liked to include a ward by ward school analysis of the number of school closures and openings by ward to kind of get at that idea that why are we seeing enrollment change so differently across wards? But because of DESE changes in the school name, and because so many schools and programs in the city have changed locations while continuing to operate, I wasn't able to get to an accurate number that I felt comfortable publishing or sharing just yet. but that is something that I hope to do in the future because it is important to help us understand where students are going to school versus maybe where they live. Which brings us to policy implications. So education policymakers are influencing and changing the city that we live in. We also know that the city is influencing the education policymakers. So we see this with school board elections or parent and family advocacy. We're seeing our policymakers feel that pressure and influence and hopefully to prompt positive change. But we also know that they're having that same effect on the surrounding city. And so recognizing just how powerful that relationship is really important. So school closures in particular are a policy decision that can have ramifications that go far beyond the school walls. We can see that it has power to transform neighborhoods just by bringing people into a neighborhood or giving them a reason not to come in. So looking at school enrollment and population decline as being intertwined and looking for policy decisions that consider those issues together is really important. In the city of St. Louis, we know that a lot of these policy decisions have been influenced or affected through racist means, through classist means, and we have the obligation now as policymakers and researchers and education leaders to look for policy solutions that reverse those bad decisions that were made previously. And at minimum, we want to make sure that we're not perpetuating these injustices that we've seen throughout our city. So future research opportunities I shared with you that I would like to look at a ward by ward analysis of school closures and openings. I think it's also important to look at historical census data through the boundaries of the new 14 wards and also projecting to the future, figuring out how many students can we expect to have in our school system in the future, how many children and their families do we expect to live here? Because as we look to right size our school system for our city, we can't just fit it to the people that we have now. We need to fit it for where we think we're going. And that can be a hard and difficult conversation for us to have if we expect decline to continue. But those are the policy decisions that need to be made, and those are the conversations that we need to be having with our leaders and with our constituencies. It would also be really powerful to go back and do some historical analyses, both quantitative and qualitative, of the decisions that have led us to this point. So schools have closed in almost every year for the past 30 years. What has been the impact of that? How have choices around school segregation or integration led us to the system that we have today? So looking historically to figure out how did we get here so we can reverse some of those injustices and also create the school system that we deserve. So takeaways, number one takeaway here is that our system of public schools is highly unstable. We've had closed 104 schools, but opened 85. So we have a lot of chaos and turmoil within our public education system as a whole. And again, only 1 year period where the number of schools stayed the same from 1 year to the next. It's important for policymakers and education leaders to look at public school enrollment and population decline together and look for policy solutions that address both simultaneously. We know that historical enrollment trends vary wildly across our geography and by grade range. And currently neither enrollment nor the number of schools is consistent or equal across the city's 14 wards. And if you are a researcher, please treat DESE records with considerable caution. LEAs and schools both change names and change codes, and even something as small as adding a period or taking it out may make it look like the LEA or school closed when in fact it's continued to operate. There are 5 appendices to this report online. So all LEA names and years of operation, all schools and years of operation. I've also included in that appendix all the name changes to help others who are cleaning their data. There is a table for enrollment and number of schools for every year. The school closures and openings by year, that is the data behind that report with the blue and gold bars and the brown line, and then system enrollment by year. So thank you. I would be happy to answer any questions, or I'd love to discuss this further, the aspects of the report that stick out to you.